We have reached the seventh video in a series of videos that are aimed at exploring how classical liberalism evolved from its conception to the 20th century in America. In our last videos, we looked at how some of the modifications were happening economically. We discussed the government showing more intervention in the dealings of America's economy by putting forward new projects for people to do. In this video, we'll examine welfare capitalism and the emergence of the welfare state, which incorporated collectivist principles into the running of America's economy. Entrepreneurs, needless to say, needed to develop a social conscience and consider the rights of their workers. The concept of equality, as a result, began to expand in the 20th century. This included both economic equality, with the fair distribution of wealth, as well as social equality. Social equality included the right for workers to gather together collectively and speak on their individual rights. Many times, both in Europe, but especially in the United States, entrepreneurs and businessmen try to ignore and put off the growing demand of their workers for establishing labor unions and the calls from the governments to help provide social programs. However, eventually, with a lot of added pressure from both the worker side as well as the government, many industrialists began to provide their workers with non-monetary rewards to help earn their loyalty. This is what we know as welfare capitalism. One of these demands was the creation of labor unions. During the 19th century, laborers wanted to improve their standards of living, and they began to attempt to form these unions. However, many of their attempts were unsuccessful. What this involved was the recognition of a new right, the right to organize and bargain collectively. Unions could definitely give their workers the power to collectively negotiate fair wages and decent working conditions, all which threatened to undermine the capitalists' control of the workplace. The workers needed to have the government on their side to stand up to these entrepreneurs. Even though the creation of these unions was completely in contrast to the profit orientation of the entrepreneurs, nevertheless, in time, these unions prevailed and established a growing number of unions throughout the world. The International Labor Union was formed in 1919 at the end of World War I, and it was a part of the League of Nations. In fact, the United Nations incorporated 2 articles in their Declaration of Human Rights that concerned labor. This was fundamental because it established the necessity for rights of the workers under the precinct of universal law. Labor unions were fundamental in expanding the concept of equality. Workers fought for their equal voice that spoke directly for their interests and reflected their perspective. More and more people began to believe that liberalism required equal opportunities and an equal respect for all members of society. In the following photograph, there is featured a labor union that is protesting for their fundamental human rights to not work more than 8 hours per day. We mean to make things over. We're tired of toil for naught, but bare enough to live on never an hour for thought. We want to see the sunshine. We want to smell the flowers. We're sure that God has willed it, and we mean to have 8 hours. We're summoning our forces from shipyard, shop, and mill. 8 hours to work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. What helped to gain force for the labor unions was government support. For example, in 1901 to 1909, the American President Theodore Roosevelt was a reformer who desired to curb the excesses of laissez-faire capitalism early on. For example, in 1902, 50,000 United Mine Workers of northern Pennsylvania walked out of their job, demanding a raise of 10 to 20% in their pay and a recognition of their union, as well as an 8-hour workday. The mine owners, of course, refused all of their demands and called on the president to call the army against the workers. Instead, however, Roosevelt threatened to call out the army against the owners if the owners continued to treat their workers this way. Now, most of the early legislation that were based on the principles of welfare capitalism were oriented towards the workplace. They did not include issues such as child poverty, disability, housing standards, education, or other circumstances where individuals might need some sort of financial support from the government. In addition, however, with the onset of the First World War, the Reformation, the zeal died down. There became a new focus for the government, and now is preparing for war. They needed the support of the industrialists and the businessmen to help them fund sufficient war supplies. And with this, Unit 4 is brought to a close. In this unit, we explored the question of to what extent did classical liberalism meet the needs of society. We started off by examining some of the major social issues that arose in the 19th century in Europe, the biggest issue being the lack of an equal distribution of wealth. The state of discontent in Europe, and especially in England, led to the development of competing movements and ideologies against classical liberalism. These ideologies, such as socialism, were focused on more collectivist principles. Lastly, we examined America as a case study of how some of the classical liberal ideas emerged and evolved in time. These included shifts in the economy and how much intervention the government has in the economy of the country. We also looked at equality and how the concept of equality expanded. In the next unit, we'll be focusing on the total rejections of classical liberalism as an ideology that were happening in other countries in the world, such as Russia and fascist Germany. In these countries, classical liberal ideas were completely disregarded in exchange for competing ideologies.